It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we welcome one of our favorite guests. She is a GPI award-nominated breakout star in the game today. Boo, robbed, absolutely robbed. Vanessa Kade, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, 2021 was obviously a massive year for you. You won the anniversary Sunday Millions and then just casually hopped into some PokerGo Highrollers, as you do, cashing 3 in the space of, if I remember correctly, about a fortnight. This hand comes from one of your 2 final tables in those games. It's from the 25k, and you are 5-handed on a table that includes Dan Shak, Jacob Daniels, Ivan Zufic, and former guest David Peters. ICM is, of course, important, so I'll give the payout structure to 5th gets 138k, 4th gets 172,500, 3rd gets 224,250, 2nd gets 345k, and 1st takes home 465,750. The blinds are 25.50 with a 50k big blind ante. Vanessa, you are the chip leader with 2.8 million, 56 big blinds. Zufic is in second with 2.6 million. He's got 52 big blinds. Daniels has 2 million, Peters has 1.6 million, and Dan Shak has 1.5 million. Peters raises to 105k in first position, the hijack with the King of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds. Vanessa, in the cutoff, you make it 300k with the Jack of Hearts, Jack of Clubs. Action folds around to Zufic in the small blind. He has the Ace of Clubs, Queen of Spades, and he elects to 4-bet to 750k, putting in almost 30% of his stack. Peters folds, and the action is back on you. You decide to call. Vanessa, this is a really interesting street. Peters has a legit open, and once it gets back to him, he's an easy fold. Your 2 decision points, however, are both very tricky. Folding to the first raise is, of course, out of the question. So it's just a case of, do you call or do you raise? Both seem pretty reasonable. Why did you decide to take the aggressive approach?
I mean, out of the entire table, probably Peters and I are both opening the widest, and Jacks are just way ahead of his range. Just both to get more money in and also to narrow down what he's seeing a flop with.
Well, Dara, few people in the game understand the ICM model better than you do. Vanessa made the case there for raising, pretty reasonable too. I'm sure she's right that Peters will be opening wide, and I remember watching this and you two were battling away. Can you make the case for flatting though?
Yeah, you certainly can make the case for flatting. In ICM extreme situations, particularly when you're relatively deep stacked, what tends to happen when you look at solver output is the solver generally just wants to 3-bet way less and wants to flat more. That's down to a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is that once you 3-bet, you start getting to this spot now where the stacks are potentially at risk by the river, and therefore ICM becomes even more extreme. And usually the solvers essentially contract the value part of the range. So, obviously a hand like Jacks in a no ICM situation will be a perfectly standard 3-bet. But in an ICM extreme situation, you often see the solvers only want to say maybe even go with aces and kings and ace king as the value part. And then they flat everything below that. And then they use whatever they need to balance the top, which again won't be too much because of the fact that the 3-bet value range has contracted. So you actually do see a lot more flatting in general. And you see a sort of a tippy-tappy approach post-flop as well, where instead of taking more aggressive lines, the solvers often just call to keep the pot small.
Very good. Well, as I said, after raising to 300k, Zufic puts in the cold 4-bet to 750k, laying you a great price, has got to be said, Vanessa. I've got to say, in his shoes, I'm inclined to just toss this hand. But if you are going to add in 1 or 2 cold 4-bet bluffs, it is the right candidate. Dara, I'll start with you this time. If he's going to be balanced with a non-all-in 4-bet strategy, he obviously has to find some bluffs to go with his aces and kings and deuces. Has he chosen wisely? And if so, how careful does he have to be about not including too many? Like, I'm guessing ace-queen is maybe only a raise some frequency.
Yeah, I mean, again, he's kind of in a similar spot that the range is contract. Like, probably aces is the only real hand he wants to juice action with. Even if he has kings, there's an argument for just sticking it in. But I suspect aces is the only pure juice in his seat, and kings maybe at some frequency. And he probably shoves kings the rest of the time, shoves queens and shoves ace king. That means he doesn't have too much to balance, basically, his 4-bet range. Maybe aces all the time and kings some of the time. But the next best hand to choose is the hand just below that. In these spots, you pretty much want to go linear rather than polarized. So ace queen, the next hand down, is absolutely the best hand for him to do this with.
Very good. Well, back to you, Vanessa, in such a gross spot now. It's a spot where I would just fold online. I suppose I feel like I'm either flipping or behind. You're in a sort of a dark tunnel and maybe not always deep enough to navigate. That said, live is a really different animal, and I definitely flat some spots like this when I feel like I have a decent read on my opponent and maybe even could spook them a little bit, because by flatting there, it seems so strong from you that they're almost forced into playing more honestly post-flop. What do you think of that, and how did you factor in the two competing forces? One, that your hand has shriveled up in relative value, but two, he is laying a ridiculously good price.
He is laying a good price. I'm in position in his hand. I also think he just gets most of his really good hands in. The 4-bet, the size of it and everything, it just felt really weak to me. And so even though I'd be tempted to lay down a hand like this to a lot of 4-bets, in this case, it just felt like I was giving up too much value. So obviously we're never shoving over top of that here, just because his entire range is almost value that has us crushed, except for the fact that he just raised this odd amount. So I thought we'd peel and see what happens. Also, there's the fact that Peters and I are both the most aggressive players at the table. So, if I was him and looking at that hand out of position, thinking like these two are crazy, they're just raising like a lot of stuff, being really aggressive on a final table. And like, I'm going to have to use this. I don't know if he was thinking it was value or a bluff at the point he put in the 4-bet, but if he just thought that against both of our ranges, he just has to raise, then that means that I have to peel. And even like, I know he should be balancing this with aces sometimes, but I just was not getting aces vibes off of him.
Yeah, that's a really interesting counterpoint. If you have that dynamic at the table where a really aggro Peters, a really aggro Vanessa are opening and 3-betting each other, you might actually decide that a low frequency cold 4-bet would become a much higher frequency cold 4-bet as a response, just because you want to sort of fight back. I appreciate, obviously, that's not necessarily a great strategy or counter strategy from him because of how ICM crippling this situation could be for him. He is second in chips and Vanessa covers him, but it is an interesting dynamical point.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, certainly if he's overweighted towards bluffs, and, the problem is like even his bluffs tend to have decent equity against us. Like he's probably only supposed to be using ace queen. And if he wants to go wider than that, probably king queen is the next hand. And, those are two hands that we're really only flipping against. But we're getting such an amazing price here. It's very, very hard to fold anyway. Now, I understand his sizing, because if he goes any bigger, he's effectively committed. This is more or less the most he can make and still have some folds. And there's a lot to be said for just, being at the table and understanding the game flow. And certainly if you have the feeling that he's more weighted towards bluffs because he's against two aggressive players, then you really can consider folding here. But you are going to be in a horrible spot post-flop where you're going to always have the problem, unless you hit your set, of being behind the value. I mean, I guess on a king high or ace high board, we have fairly easy decisions. But if it comes 3 low cards, we're going to be in that tricky spot where we're still behind the value.
Well, let's get to the flop, because the hand does develop in a very interesting way. The pot is 1.705 million, and it comes the 8 of hearts, 6 of hearts, 4 of spades. Flush draws, withstanding this board doesn't interact with either of your ranges really. One would anticipate a bet from him all the time really, but he checks and you check back. Your check back here is super standard, but his check is really quite weird, to be honest. Darrow, is this a must bet spot for him?
Well, actually, he's kind of in a really difficult spot. I mean, when I looked at this hand initially, I thought he covered her. So therefore, if he covers her, it's definitely a must-bet spot. But when he's covered, he's in this really awkward spot. And I don't think he can get away with betting 100%. Okay. So he should be mixing bets and checks. If he bets it, he's basically just hoping A, she folds, or B, at least she doesn't raise and he gets to see the turn. But it's difficult for him now because the stack pot ratio is very low. He is covered, so he's under huge ICM pressure. She's also under ICM pressure because obviously if she gets in and loses, she's almost crippled as well. So they're both kind of in this spot now where they're playing chicken.
Indeed they are. Well, Vanessa, turning to you, obviously at some level there's kind of relief when the check comes because you are sort of in a dark tunnel against the bet with this flop not really changing much. You're going to be in a guessing game if he does make a bet, and you probably do have to call a reasonable sized bet once anyway. And that again can make it even more awkward from a stacked pot ratio. Having said that, he may be checking some of his extreme value hands too, and maybe trying to set a trap, feeling like the stacked pot ratio is low enough he could still get it in by the river. What did you make of his decision to check on this street? Because what I noticed watching the video was you were watching him like a hawk and definitely trying to pick up some physical information.
Well, my background was initially live poker, and I relied a lot on live tells originally, to the point where when I started playing online, I didn't realize how bad I was actually at poker, like the technical portion of it, where I'm just like, how are you supposed to tell if somebody's bluffing? I can't even see them. So I do rely on that a lot for live play. And I mean, to me, I actually agree with you, David. I expect him to bet his entire range here, even if it's just like really small. So I'm surprised and, like you say, actually really relieved to see a check, because I don't think he's balancing his checks properly here. I mean, if you are going to have a checking range, again, you're supposed to balance them. I don't think that is the case. And at this point, I'm pretty sure he's just playing his hand really straightforward. And this is like an ace high we're looking at here. So again, aces could hypothetically play this way, but I'm just not getting aces vibes off of this. When he checks, I'm like, okay, we're looking at ace king, maybe ace queen, and I'll give him another chance to bet the turn. So that's basically pretty much what's going through my head at that point.
Yeah, that seems very reasonable. To that turn, the pot is still 1.705 million, and it comes to 5 of diamonds. So the board now reads 8 of hearts, 6 of hearts, 4 of spades, 5 of diamonds. No sevens in either of your ranges. So this board is actually pretty dry, and this is pretty much a blank. Again, Zufic checks, but this time, Vanessa, you decide to bet. You bet 575k, about 1/3 of pot. He calls. It seemed to me, watching, that you had a very good sense of where you were, and you've sort of reiterated that now. If I had to guess, you were putting him on ace king, and I thought, I could check again, but I could also maybe do that thing where I deny a little bit of equity. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's pretty much bang on. I also know this guy, I mean, just from playing with him for a couple of days, probably thinks I'm a little bit crazy. So, I'm sure in his head there are a couple scenarios where he's actually ahead here, or like obviously still has equity, potentially hitting a river. So there's no way he's folding the turn, I think, for that size.
Yeah, Dara, I know you ran this hand, and the solver does like Vanessa's line as we predicted, but it really hates Zufic's. Can you talk us through the output?
Yeah, absolutely. The solver output on the flop for Vanessa's spot too was quite interesting in that it mixes all three options. It sometimes jams just to deny equity. It sometimes bets small. And interestingly, when it bets small, it's actually folding to a check jam. So it's essentially trying to deny equity to the bluffs. But if he check raises all in, it's just kind of waving a white flag and saying, okay, he has it. And the rest of the time it checks, as Vanessa did. In the check line, and once he checks the turn, again, it mixes checks and bets, but it mostly small bets, and it uses the size that Vanessa used and does that 80% of the time. The call for him makes no real sense at all. What the solver does here is quite interesting. 20% of the time it turns its hand into a bluff and it check jams, and the rest of the time it just folds, but it never calls.
Yeah, calling definitely doesn't make a huge amount of sense. Let's get to the river. The pot is 2.855 million. The SPR is around 0.5 to 1. It comes the 8 of clubs. So the final board now reads 8 of hearts, 6 of hearts, 4 of spades, 5 of diamonds, 8 of clubs. He checks, and you go for some gangster value here, Vanessa. You fire 500k, 17% of pot. He takes some time before calling. Firstly, I absolutely hate his line. Even more perplexing on this street. He clearly had no plan to bluff and was hoping to just hang in there with ace queen high. On the flip side, I love your bet. I feel like you have an exact handle on where you are in the hand. You probably realize you can't get a bet called at all, but you choose a size that's so small that maybe you could get that tearful call from ace king. I don't know. Talk me about your internal monologue in that moment. Did you consider playing it safe with a check, or was there something about Zufic that made you more confident you could squeeze out that teeny tiny bet?
I mean, you pretty much nailed it. There's no really playing it safe. At this point, I'm pretty sure where I'm at in the hand. Like, queens don't play this way. Like, anything that beats me, it doesn't play this way. So at this point, I'm just trying to get max value off an ace high and, just make it agonizingly small so that he feels like if there's any chance I have some other, I'm not sure what he thinks I might have that ace queen is ahead of, but maybe something. If there's any chance he thinks I'm holding something that ace queen is ahead of, that it's just like such an obnoxiously small amount relative to the pot that he feels like he has to call.
Yeah, I thought that was just a beautiful moment in the hand where you recognized exactly where you are. It sort of translates that way because when you see the hands face up, as I did watching it, it was like, oh, Vanessa's pretty much got a guy who she's pretty sure has ace high. He probably can't call any bet. Oh my God, she's picked a sizing that now he's in the bin and just sort of really doesn't want to get bluffed for that size. Like, I suppose that's what's really running through his mind is, oh my God, it would be catastrophic if I folded the best hand here. Dara, what does the solver say here? Does it go for Vanessa's thin bet? And despite the fact that he's getting 7-1, how bad is this call from Zufic?
The call is inexplicable. Like it's really difficult to understand what he thinks he might be beating at this point. The solver mixes checks and small bets as well, so both options are fine. It mostly checks, it has to be said, because like we really shouldn't be getting value from this hand. But if we're up against somebody who is going to pay us off, then that tips it. You know, anytime a solver mixes, that means that both options at equilibrium have the same EV, but that's against a balanced player. That's against a player who's not going to pay us off more often than they should. Against somebody who is going to pay us off too often, then absolutely that tips it to just always go for the small value.
And Vanessa, turning back to you for a final word, maybe. Obviously, you jumped into these high rollers. They are quite big buy-ins. I think it was 10Ks and then this 25K. I think you might have even played a 50K. I can't remember exactly, but I know you were playing really big against these guys. And you know, mostly it's elite fields. There is some value in them, but there is a lot of elite players around. Do you feel a greater onus when you're in that environment to find these thin value bets? Like, to miss a value bet like this would be scandalous because you just have to find every little bit of equity you can when you're up against that caliber of opponent.
I think that's a really good observation. And yeah, I mean, anytime that I think we're ahead in these fields, like you definitely have to maximize as much as you can, especially on the later streets where you're likely to get more, because the spots where it's clear that you're ahead, that you can potentially get value are fewer in between in those kind of fields. So yeah, definitely going first in value and taking as many spots as we can is ideal in these kind of fields.
Great stuff. Well, a really interesting hand and one that I wanted to cover ever since I watched it live last summer. Dara, thank you very much for the deep dive into the analysis. And Vanessa Kade, thank you so much for bringing us this fantastic hand and talking us through your thought process.
You bet. Thanks for going through the hand with me.
Thanks, Vanessa.